we did have this week the completion of the work in the children's room for the artwork up there. So our animals that are on the wall now have faces for the giraffe, and some of the other animals have a little better face on them than what was before. So appreciate Tricia Dancy for what she did there. But last Sabbath, I had just a brief little conversation with a few folks, and one of the things that we were talking about is one of the particular op-eds that I like to read on a regular basis is called thefreepress.com. It is certainly, I would categorize it as a website for which it is moderate. It is not left, it is not right. It's pretty much in the center. And one of the individuals that writes a lot there, her name is Barry Weiss, and she wrote an article the other day that I think is very indicative of the times in which we're living, that I wanted to briefly read some excerpts from and then talk about it from our viewpoint of perspective. In this particular article that was entitled In DEI, she writes, "It's not about diversity, equity, or inclusion. It's about arrogating power to a movement that threatens not just Jews, but America itself. 20 years ago, when I was a college student, I started writing then about a nameless niche ideology that seemed to contradict everything that I had been taught since I was a child. It's possible that I could not have perceived the nature of this ideology, or rather that I would have been able to avoid seeing its true nature had I not been a Jew, but I was and I am. And in noticing the way that I had been witnessing or been rather written out of the equation, I started to notice that it wasn't just me, but that the whole system seemed an illusion. What I saw was a worldview that replaced basic ideas of good and evil with a new rubric. The powerless, and she puts in parentheses good, and the powerful, and in parentheses she puts bad. It replaced lots of things: color blindness with race obsession, ideas with identity, debate with denunciation, persuasion with public shaming, the rule of law with the fury of the mob." I put on the table this particular article, if you'd like to get it. I didn't want to hand it out to everyone. I'd be afraid if I did that immediately, I'd see the tops of heads and not actually faces. But it is a very, very interesting view, because DEI is something that is, if you're working today in society, or you're in any kind of educational system, or if you're watching the news, you're seeing a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And just like many things in life, what it appears on the surface is not what reality is. And we see a lot of things going on in the world around us, and the perception that people have of one thing is not what reality is. It is interesting because this whole concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion seems very, very nice and seems very right on the surface. But what's below the surface? And we all know the iceberg below the surface is what rips a hole in the ship and makes it sink. There's another article that I posted, and by the way, for those online, you can go on our website. I've posted all these articles so you can click on them and see them. And this was from the website called InsideHigherEducation.com. And the name of it is, or the article was, House Representatives, or Republicans rather, blame DEI programs for rise in campus anti-Semitism. And I'll read just a few excerpts from this particular article. And it said, at a hearing Tuesday, that was Tuesday of this week, Democrats disagreed and said that the Education Department's Office of Civil Rights is facing budget cuts and needs more money to respond to the crisis. Diversity, equity, and inclusion programs on college campuses are behind the recent spike in campus anti-Semitism, several House Republicans said Tuesday during a hearing on confronting, quote, the scourge of anti-Semitism on campus. I think DEI is a fraud. And what we're seeing now on campuses is proof of that, said Burgess Owens, the Utah Republican who chairs the House Higher Education Subcommittees. And by the way, just for the record, Burgess Owens is a black man. Democrats and Republicans on the subcommittees condemned the increase in anti-Semitism and its incidents on college campuses since the start of the Israeli-Hamas war last month. Some Democrats decried the increase in Islamophobia incidents, though that was not the focus of the particular hearing. It is interesting when you look at this, Congress is now reviewing this because of the protests and the things that we have seen. And it is, quite candidly, when you look at it, a real dichotomy. We think, how is this possible? How are there people, particularly younger people in our nation of higher education, supporting what we see to have been such a horrific event? Now, don't get me wrong. No one is as pure as the driven snow in this world. We're not even as Christians, for that matter. But at the end of the day, there are certain lines that you cannot cross in supporting some of the things we've seen. The perception and the perspective that people have seen from the same event to be so diametrically different from each other, it's staggering. And Barry Weiss, as well as many individuals, are looking at something that's been going on in our educational system for quite some time, and we are now beginning to see the fruits of it. Steve shared with me an article that I put on our website regarding agendas going on in the lower elementary classes, and agendas that we see in major big cities for which people now are migrating even through higher education. And now we see things that, in all candor, my age, and I don't consider myself greatly that old right now, am shocked with what I see. Just really shocked. And it starts with something that's been going on for quite some time. And names and labels get put on ideas and ideologies that result in things that we see happen in a very dramatic way in our eyes in front of us today. I entitled this message, as you see here, Perspectives, because we're seeing something that we need to be able to identify and view in the world around us, and our own society for that matter, but then take that and not just demagogue it and criticize it, but then internalize the lesson we see from that within ourselves. I'd like for us to begin today by turning over to James chapter 4, if you have your Bibles. When we look at the gospel or the apostle James and some of the things that he wrote to the early church was, one of those time frames for which a lot of turmoil was going on within the church, as we see turmoil going on within our country and within society, the world in general, not just our own United States of America, but across the world. There are concepts and things that seem to never change over the course of time. And in chapter 4 of James, we will back up to verse 13. He says to the church, "Come now then, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit." In other words, life goes on and this is what we're going to do, plans and whatnot. And he goes on to say in verse 14, "Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow." None of us do. "You are just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away." In the wintertime, when you walk outside and you blow and you see it and how quickly it goes away from the air temperature compared to the temperature coming out of what's in you, and you see the vapor. And that's how he's doing a parallel with life. Instead, in verse 15, you ought to say, "If the Lord wills, and we will live, and also do this or do that." In other words, instead of just making your plans, make your plans along with what the will of God is what James is really, it seems like, trying to articulate to the church. Verse 16, "But as it is, you boast in arrogance. All such boasting is evil." Of course, we look at arrogance, and Barry Weiss in that article that I was sharing, it references that this DEI is all about arrogant power over people.
That's what is really behind the scenes of three words that we would all agree that are, yes, good things, but what's behind it is what's evil. Verse 17, and this is the main point. Therefore, to the one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin. You know, we oftentimes look at Jesus Christ and look at him coming to, expound the ways of God, the laws, the statutes, the judgments, live them, and not just talk about the letter of the law, but the attitude of the law. James, who many say was a half brother of Jesus, as far as a human in his family, is also, I think, taking that same concept and expanding it out a little more. Even for things that we know are the right things to do, and when we withhold doing the right things, in other words, we didn't technically break a law, but the attitude of the law is to do good to people, not do harm to people, and then you withhold doing the right thing because your heart is withholding it, that's evil and that's sin. That is taking it, as we say, a whole nother level, and something for us to consider. Let's turn over to John chapter 12. John chapter 12. My thought in all of this today is that, we see so many things that are happening in front of our eyes today that I say, and I don't want to sound like the old person that I used to criticize when I was a much younger person, but I mean, it just blows my mind today watching the news, seeing this. And I don't know about you, I have to kind of take it in spells. I can't take it all at one time because it's just too distraughting. It's too, it's too much to entail on consuming it daily. My fear is that all these things begin to wear on us if we're not careful, if we're not resolute. Here in John 12, I'd like for us to look at verse 47 and 48. This particular area, Jesus was talking and talking to the disciples and those around him about his impending death. And he makes a statement here. He says, if anyone hears my sayings and does not keep them, I do not judge him. For I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world. Of course, he's talking about his first coming. Verse 48, he who rejects me and does not receive my sayings has one who judges him. The word I spoke is what will judge him at the last day. And of course, we know Jesus would make the comment that he is the one that will judge us because the Father's given all judgment to him. He is the Word. He is the Logos. All of that's very consistent when we're seeing that. But in his human form, he wasn't to be the judge. It is in his exalted form that he is now that he will be the judge. So we see a couple of facts there. God judges people based on their understanding and what is true, and their understanding of what is truth. When you think about what James said and you think about what Jesus is saying here, there are individuals and there are times even in our own lives and in our process of conversion for which we don't understand the truth. And maybe when we don't understand what's the right thing and we withhold it, it's viewed a little bit differently than when we know the right thing and we withhold it. Two different things altogether when we think about that. In the greater scheme of things, they're not the same, or they're not different. They are the same because good's being withheld. The difference is whether an individual knows it's the right thing to do or not. And that is viewed from a judgment standpoint differently than an individual who doesn't know. Let's turn over to Psalms 39. Psalms 39. The thing for all of us to consider is if we may watch these things going on in the world around us and criticize them and may be right in the way we should view what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's evil. We don't call evil good. We don't call good evil. And so by understanding that, and our understanding is, as Paul would say, through a mirror dimly. We don't have total understanding, but what we understand, we have to have a true perspective of, a right perspective of, and not play games. Not like we see where we have things listed as good, but evil is behind them. We cannot be that type of person. And all of us have a perception of ourselves. Verse 6 of Psalms 39 says, "Surely every man walks about as a phantom. Surely they make an uproar for nothing. He amasses riches and does not know who will gather them." You know, what's the psalmist talking about? It appears the psalmist is really saying that every person, including you, including me, we have an image of ourself. And we have plans for ourselves, like James said. And sometimes those images and sometimes the view that we have is not exactly what it needs to be. We're not exactly the person we should be, and we're not exactly the person sometimes we present ourselves to be. By that, let's turn over to Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7. This becomes very evident to us when we consider, when we view other people. You know, we can criticize what we see in the world, we can criticize individuals in the world, but do we take the time to apply that same amount of judgment that we pass on others on ourselves? It's only a question you can answer with what goes on between your ears, and then what you have in your prayer life and what you have in your relationship with the Father and Jesus Christ. Here in Matthew 7, verses 1 through 5, we read, "Do not judge so that you will not be judged." And of course, this is condemnation, the word judge here. All the translations in English, when you look at the Greek and you look at the English, it really more appropriately should be condemnation, not necessarily dividing like judging, but condemning individuals. For in the way you judge, and if you just with the word condemn, in the way you condemn, you will be condemned. And by the standard of measures, it'll be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck that's in your brother's eye and do not notice the log that is in your own eye? And how can you say to your brother, "Let me take that speck out of your eye," and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Jesus is using, obviously, a lot of imagery here, a lot of analogies, but these are things for you and I to consider about ourselves too, relative to what we see in the world. We all walk around with an image. Is that image, first of all, the right image? And is that image true all the way through within us? Or is it only on the facade and not what's inside? Jesus would use the example of white sepulchres and whatnot with the Pharisees. They had the law of God. They had many of the knowledge points that we consider are so important, but they missed the point of how to judge things appropriately. They didn't judge with righteous judgment, as Jesus would say. And Jesus told his disciples to judge with righteous judgment. Not with just judgment, but righteous judgment. Let's turn over to Luke chapter 18. Luke chapter 18. Here we'll look at, again, the point that Jesus is driving is to be consistent and be sincere. Parable we read oftentimes around the time of the Passover begins in verse 9. And he told this parable to some of the people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous. In other words, their viewpoint of themselves was one thing. He could see that it was wrong. He says this, he gives this parable, and of course they missed the point because their image of themselves was very wrong. And he viewed others with contempt. That's how they viewed people. You and I can't be this way. Even in all of the dramatic things we see going on around in the world around us. Verse 10, 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. Notice this, they're going to the temple, both of them. The imagery here is of someone who has right knowledge. We're not talking about a Buddhist and a Christian. We're not talking about, and if you really wanted to split some hairs here, we're not even talking about, in today's society, a Catholic and, as we would say, a true Christian. We're talking about 2 true Christians, maybe, from the viewpoint of the impression given and the viewpoint given. The Pharisee and the tax collector. because we're talking about a group of people for which they had the law, they knew the law, it was, around them all the time. We're not talking about that part. We're talking about self-deception and self-views. The Pharisee in verse 11 stood and was praying to himself, God, I thank you that I'm not like the people, other people, swindlers, unjust, idolaters, adulterers, and even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes on all that I get. But the tax collector, standing some distance away, and the assumption here given is that the tax collector was doing many of these things, was unwilling to lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat on his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, the sinner, viewing himself in a different viewpoint than the Pharisee was. I tell you, this man went to his house justified rather than the other. In other words, his events and what he did wasn't necessarily the thing. He was justified because his view and his image of himself was consistent with what the judge was looking at, in this case, Jesus Christ. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted. I think there's many more aspects of that parable that are very important for us to understand. But we see in this parable two different approaches to life, images, and judgment or condemnation. Or I should say judgment and condemnation in this case. And these are things for you and I to think and consider. How do we keep ourselves from being the Pharisee in this particular parable? Well, there's three things that I want us to consider. The first thing is to ask our Father to show us ourselves in the true light. Turn over to Jeremiah chapter 10. Jeremiah chapter 10. Jeremiah makes a plea to God. Obviously, Jesus was the God of the Old Testament, the one who became Jesus, I should say. And he now sits with the Father on the right hand. And we see here in Jeremiah chapter 10, here's a prophet of God. And what's the prophet saying? Here's an individual that God is speaking to, and God is telling him the issues and problems of, my air quotes here, his people, Judah. And he's telling him, you go tell these people this, but what's the prophet's approach? Verse 23, I know, O Lord, that a man's way is not in himself, nor is it in a man who walks to direct his steps. Correct me, O Lord, but with justice, not with your anger, or you will bring me to nothing. I think that in a very similar attitude, I'm not saying similar as far as the parable goes of individuals, but the tax collector and even the prophet here are similar in attitude. Ask. Ask and you shall receive, as we know. Turn over to Proverbs chapter 27. Proverbs chapter 27. If we go with a right heart, I don't think we serve a God, a father and our elder brother, who will do anything but good things for us. This is a scripture that, I really don't see and hear quoted and referenced anymore like we once did at one time. Proverbs 27, verse 17, iron sharpens iron. So one man sharpens another. We can ask God to give us a right perspective of ourselves, but I would also say that there are individuals that if we truly are careful and we select the right types of people and we go and ask people to help us in our right heart and right mind, and we're willing to listen, that's a key component there, because many people today, myself included, you don't necessarily go around giving your opinion about things all the time because, one, it wasn't asked for. Second, you're careful to give it because even if it's asked for, is it really being asked for the right reason, or is it being asked to whip back on me and cut my head off? You have to be careful with this. But if we seek it from the right types of people, iron can sharpen iron. So we have to hear and we have to listen. Let's turn over to 2 Timothy chapter 4. 2 Timothy chapter 4. Most of what I think is important for us to consider is that in order for us to understand and be given more understanding, we must utilize what understanding we have appropriately now first, a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time. The Apostle Paul, he gives something for us to always be mindful of when we're dealing with people and we're dealing with anyone. A reminder here, and beginning in verse 14, he says, Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm. The Lord will repay him according to his deeds. Be on your guard against him yourself, for he vigorously opposes our words. You know, when we see that, we know that we have to go and ask for the right individuals to give us the input. Trusted individuals, not everybody. Some people will purposely cause harm and desire to cause harm. Be careful with that. Let's turn over to 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel, we have an example that's given to us in 2 Samuel of David. And we have the story that I know we reference in chapter 12 and so many times, and we think through what David did. And, you know, I guess there's an element of I'm glad that we don't have any more books being added to the Bible right now, because if you and I are included in that list, maybe some of our dirty laundry, air quotes, so to speak, would be in books and others may see it. And, you know, it's not something that I don't think in this case David was at all happy, but that's not what I'm driving when I look at this example here in chapter 12. We'll begin in chapter 12, and I must be in the, no, where? Chapter 12, verse 1. I thought I was in 1 Samuel. Then the Lord sent Nathan, who was a prophet, to David, and he came to him and said, there were two men in one city, the rich one and the other poor. The rich man had a great many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing except one ewe lamb, baby lamb, which he brought and nourished, and it grew up together with him and his children, and it would eat with his bread and drink from his cup and lie in his bosom like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take from his own flock, from his own herd, to prepare for the wayfarer or the visitor who had come to him. Rather, he took the poor man's ewe lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. And we see inequity in this, total inequity, just like we see a lot of inequity in the world around us. And David was angry, it says in verse 5, and he burned greatly against the man. He said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, surely the man who's done this deserves to die. Verse 6, he must make restitution for the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing and had no compassion. That was the thing that David drew out of this. No compassion, no caring whatsoever, no empathy whatsoever. Just a in-your-face, audacious move. Nathan then in verse 7 said to David, you are the man. Can you imagine how David must have felt? Nathan is using a parable much like Jesus would use a parable, and makes the point in a very succinct manner. Thus says the Lord God of Israel, it is I who anointed you king over Israel, and it is I who delivered you from the hand of Saul. Notice that. God sent Nathan. Nathan gave the message, and David was, as we would say, totally devastated by it. What was David's response? Well, we see David's response in verse 13. Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, the Lord has taken away your sin. You shall not die. Dare say that if David had a different response internally that came out externally in that particular environment, the verdict and the judgment could have been vastly different. And from that judgment, a condemnation vastly different. The interesting part of that was, I didn't read verses 8 through 12 because there were consequences for the actions that David would have to endure. You and I have consequences for our actions as time goes on. You know, when we think about it, we see here an example of David not only willing to accept what was given, but we see that he heard something. He heard truth and he responded to it, even against his own indignation and his own sins. And he had that ability to listen and to listen well. We can learn from the lessons of others. The Bible is replete with lessons of individuals. David's one of them, but there's many others for which there's things for us to learn. Let's turn over to Acts chapter 9, just to give a New Testament flair to this. You know, when we think about it, we can learn from the world we see around us. We can learn and see that in the case of what I was presenting earlier with DEI, it appears on the surface to be one thing, but with behind the scenes, it appears to many people to be something far more sinister in nature. You and I can appear to be one thing on the surface, but if not careful, we can be something very, very different behind the scenes. It's all about the heart. It's all about what we do. And sometimes we can start out bad and still turn with the right heart if we ask and we hear and when we can learn from others' experiences. Here in Acts chapter 9, we see the example of the Apostle Paul. In verse 3, it references the fact that, he was traveling and he was struck down by light. And, he was traveling with these other individuals. Jesus has a moment with him, and we have, in our vernacular today, that moment for which we have a get right with Jesus. This was that moment for Paul in this case. And Paul on the road to Damascus was knocked down. But even though he was knocked down, he listened. Now, all of us sometimes can listen and change, and sometimes events are what we listen to. Not the words, but the events. Paul, it appears, in this case, had to have a little different approach than just a parable given to him like Nathan gave to David. But at least he did the right thing. We know in verse 8, or chapter 8, I should say, that in verse 1 of chapter 8, he was the individual who went about pursuing to kill individuals. He pulled people out of their houses that were in the way, as we see in verse 3. But in chapter 9, after he is knocked down and after he listens, we see a different individual altogether. And we see that there were others who knew about him. Ananias in verse 13 makes the comment even to God and says, hey, I've heard about this man. I've heard all the harmful things he's done. Are you sure you want to do this? And Ananias listens. And Ananias goes and anoints him. And we see a completely different individual go forward from that. And hopefully we can learn from that. I guess the thing that I want to close with is the experience that we see that even Jesus Christ went through to learn. Let's turn over to Hebrews chapter 5. Hebrews chapter 5. We reference the God of the Old Testament. We reference him as being what came in the form of Jesus Christ, and we know he came in the form, as we read earlier, to die for mankind, and to save and to justify and to be the justifier. And then he will come again as the judge, and he will be our final ultimate judge. And the way in which he judges is with righteous judgment. And he couldn't do that unless he came as a human being to know what it's like to be as the creation. And so as a result of that, he came in the flesh. And verse 7 in chapter 5 of Hebrews tells us, in the days of his flesh, he offered up both prayers and supplications with loud crying and with tears to the one, speaking of the Father, able to save him from death. He knew what it was like. And the innuendo we're getting from this is that the human part of us that doesn't want to die and be murdered and be tortured and go through, he went through that, just like you and I. And he goes on to say, and he was heard because of his piety. It was because he lived a consistent manner. The persona, the image that he gave of himself was exactly what he was. And that's what you and I are to follow, emulate, and be a disciple of. Verse 8 in conclusion says, although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. You and I are suffering in a world. We may not be suffering as others are suffering, but all of us are suffering. We are experiencing what many people in the world are experiencing as well. There is a lot of injustice, a lot of inequity. There are a lot of things for which people talk of equity and talk of being just that are not. They are not what on the surface what they appear to be. And you and I can suffer the consequences if we're not as wise as a serpent and as harmless as a dove.